Okay,
Terry,
let's get started. My name is Terry Swartz Russell. I'm the Director of Family and Adult Education at Temple Emmanuel. Tonight's program is part of two things that we have ongoing at Temple Emmanuel. We have a wonderful cadre of people who are members who write books. So we decided that since we'll be talking to a bunch of them and already have, we've started a new program called TE Writes. So Ruth Cope will be our first TE Writes author. And this is also, the subject tonight fits under the category of our Death Cafe initiative, which has been going on for 2 years. So we welcome both Dr. Ruth Cope and Rabbi Michelle Robinson. And I just want to say, if you have other subjects and topics that you'd like us to cover in our Death Cafe initiative programs, you can send them to me directly, or you can put them in the chat to me. But for tonight, we're going to turn it over right now to Rabbi Robinson, who's going to introduce our speaker and have a wonderful conversation.
thank you so much, Terry, and thank you for all of your efforts that you make every single day to make these programs possible for us. And you mentioned chat, and I just want to invite anyone, as you have questions along the way, you can feel free to send them to me or to Caitlin directly through the chat, and we will have a time for each of you to be able to ask those questions of Ruth. Ruth, it's such a privilege to be here tonight with you. You are not only an extraordinary mental health practitioner in your own right, you are also the longtime leader of our Temple Emmanuel bereavement group. And you have ushered countless souls through the challenge and the trauma of losing someone they love. And you have helped guide them as their helper, as their support, as they walk through the very painful landscape of loss. And in this book that you wrote, and you can now add author to all of those titles, in this book, you shared a very personal grief, the grief for your beloved son, for Larry. And I just want to ask you, as we start off this conversation tonight, you know, your book is called Losing Larry, but you had expertise in the place and the space that none of us ever want to have expertise in the land of grief. Before even Larry was diagnosed, you had already been on a journey through grief in the loss of your husband. And into that landscape came this diagnosis and then eventually losing your son. And I want to ask you to share a little bit with us about your journey to and through grief.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Michelle. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I hope it will lead to discussion rather than my talking about what I have written or what have you. It's really about a life experience, mine, but not solely mine at all. And that I know so definitely. But I think that I'd like to talk about what is grief. We're talking about grief. Well, what is grief? There are many definitions one can use about grief. We can talk about grief, about things that are perhaps, I wouldn't say insignificant, but less or low or little, like forgetting where I put my pen. Or they are certainly much larger in terms of the loss of someone very dear. And we use the same word, grief. And so how in the world do we even define what grief is? So, I pulled it together probably from many definitions and say grief is an emotional, I do underscore emotional. It can also be physiological as well as emotional response to a loss. How do you define the loss? I mean, we can go from little to large to deep to profound, but that's anyone's definition. When we're feeling grief about a loss, that's what's real, and that's what I'd like to be addressing, but I will be addressing it in a particular way tonight because we're speaking about the book, Losing Larry. So I'm speaking about it in terms of losing someone very dear. Larry is. I never can say was. I always slash and say is, because he will always live with me. So we're going to be speaking, however, about the experience of this particular loss. But I think in my responses to your questions, I broaden it. I think that grief is very heavy.
Yeah. And as you were going through that personal story of grief, can you just tell us a little bit, for those who haven't read your book, tell us a little bit about the journey, the story of losing Larry and your process as a mother.
Well, I remember exactly when Larry called me. I was living in New York City at that time, working at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, actually, in psychosocial research. Loving it and loving New York City. I was just amazed at what you could do, what you could see, when you could go and how, all of that. And in the midst of this, and it was a few years into my being in New York, I got a call from Larry who said, "Mom, they think something's wrong with my blood." And I said, "What?" Just like that. And that led to a month of going back and forth between New York and Boston, and reaching a diagnosis that my son had contracted an acute form of leukemia. And my ending the research that I was doing and moving back to Boston, where I wanted to be. In no way did I want, no matter that my son was an adult, he was in his 30s at that time. He was my son, my child. In no way did I want him to go through this alone. And whatever help I could give him, I didn't think I was the only person who could give him help, but I wanted to be there with him. So, Larry was 38 at that time, and he was working as a software developer and engineer. And as I said, I was living in New York City. What we did is we pooled our energy and gave every ounce to manage the disease and attempting to understand healing, and if there was healing, and recreating some kind of life. But this disease was much too arrogant to give us a chance. And I must have written that, I don't know when, and I've always liked that. The disease was too arrogant. And before caring for Larry, however, it was a good almost 20 years before, I cared for my husband, Stuart, who at age 48 had contracted gastroesophageal cancer and managed to live not the 3 months that the doctors predicted, but for 3 years. They weren't easy years, but he was with us. We were with him. We had married while he was in medical school and spent the years of his internship and residency having a family and forming life together. So, when I think of this, I ask myself so many times, how does one ever heal from such profound loss and its subsequent grief? I wondered if I'd ever find life again. In the book, I wondered what healing could possibly mean. I can ask that question today. We can all talk about that. What does it mean? Could I or anyone in a similar place ever heal from such a tragic loss? I think that gives the basis.
So Ruth, I just want to cut to the chase of that question, right? If we read your book,
Mhm.
do we get the answer to that question? How can someone heal from such a loss?
I grappled with that. I can't tell you how long, and still grapple with that. I think where I place it is that healing is not like returning to how we were when we were age 10 or 20 or 25 or 30, could run a mile or a half mile or whatever it was, could expect to handle things in the way that we did then. Healing is a way of taking in what's happened. We change because of this. I think we're each changed by it. Does it mean we can't laugh and we can't enjoy? No, but it all takes time that we integrate what's happened. That doesn't mean we forget it or that it's buried. It's very much a part of us every day and remains very much a part every single day. But it's how we make a relationship with it. Can I say that? A relationship with our own life experience, so that we can hold it, not move on as moving away, but move on with it, because we have become, what can I say? We are changed by it. I could say that simply, and I think we are. We've grown by it. I can say that, even if the experience is one we'd never want to repeat or wish on anyone.
It's profound, Ruth. Thank you. I actually want to turn to the question. You've helped so many people who are struggling over the years with just unimaginable grief through our Temple Emmanuel bereavement group. And you've done that for more years than I can count, with such a steadfast and loving and giving heart. And I want to ask you, what are some of the most impactful teachings that you've found there that you share with others? And what have you learned there for yourself?
I've thought about this question. I will still think about it and continue to think about it. But for this evening, let me first say that I so appreciated the opportunity to facilitate this group. And I actually thought of myself, and still continue to think of myself, as a member of the group, as I, along with everyone sitting in this circle, have experienced the regrettable, can I say that? The wished that it never had happened, loss. But the men and women, perhaps more women than men, who joined in, whether once or many times in this group, were just amazing insofar as they were ready to be open, to talk about their loss, and to receive what others say about loss, so that they were willing to open, to share, to listen, to be, and to support. All of that. Probably a very important lesson was the benefit of being in a group. I often feel that when we feel vulnerable, we often feel like hanging back, of not putting ourselves out there. But every person who attends this group or has attended this group risks putting herself and himself out there to describe what he or she has experienced, and not just leave it as information, but the feelings that were attached to it. And I think being with others, listening, taking the chance to share, although challenging, especially if you're feeling vulnerable and alone, and one often feels that way in grief, is the most important thing we can do. Just by sharing, it helps others who have also lost, whether it's the same, smaller, larger, different. This is a life experience.
Do you have, when you're in group, do you have a sense of people comparing their losses or minimizing their losses against somebody else, sort of ranking level of loss? Or do you find that people are able to accept that their pain is their pain?
I don't know if they do the latter, but we don't certainly, and I think the former of comparing or listening and thinking, oh my God, I don't know how I'd ever go through that. I'm sure every one of us responds to what else is being introduced in the group. It doesn't become a topic of conversation in terms of, oh, my loss wasn't like that. Although someone may have said it and someone may say it every time, and I may not just underscore it. Because I think we do think about our own experiences and others' experiences and how they're different, how they're alike. Maybe we don't even think of how they are very much alike.
How has writing your experience, your particular story with Larry helped you as you think about holding the grief of others in this world?
I have to say that writing for me has been a very positive experience. It helps me. I've often said, I put myself down in black and white, like the pen on paper. And then I take myself back into myself. I sort of see myself on the paper, and then I bring myself back into me. Writing helps me not just think, not just plan, but feel, see, get it. Maybe not get it right away, but for me, it's such an important process. And the writing of the book about Larry, I started actually, and I think I told you this, Michelle, I started writing this book when Larry was, I won't say he was well, he was already diagnosed. But I was so sure he was going to beat this. That's all there was to it. He was going to beat it. I'm sure that's a typical feeling of any parent for any child, or any parent for any friend, who knows? This is a typical feeling. He was going to make it. And so I started writing, telling my son that I was going to write a book of success about his beating this leukemia. That's when I say the leukemia was far more arrogant than me. Yet writing was I feel blessed that I can do that. For the many ways it has me put out an idea, take in an idea, get to know myself a little better. It's a multi-level process and a multi-level benefit. I guess I could say that.
Do you recommend writing as a helpful way to process grief for others?
Well, I have my ways, certainly, and I can speak about that. I think it works for some. I think it doesn't work for others. So I wouldn't say yes, please, but I'd say it helps me.
Ruth Gold actually asked in the chat if you felt that Larry was as confident about his eventual recovery as you yourself were.
What a good question that is. What a very good question that is, Ruth. Thank you for asking me. I have to dig back into myself to Larry's first reactions. The only thing I come up with at this point, and I'll have to think further about it, is that when I told him I was beginning to write a book, he said, "What in the world do you want to write a book for? Who would want to read something like this?" And he was, and I said, you know what? I have looked online. I have looked here. I've looked there. There are books about illness and what have you, but there's nothing about how relationship helps and how important it is. And I don't know if I've just veered off your question, Michelle.
No, it's
feel like-
beautiful.
Yeah.
I think I actually want to dig into that question of relationship. And in order to do that, I want to sort of take a step back, because your book really speaks about faith in, it's kind of a missive of struggle with faith.
Mhm.
And I want to ask you about your own faith as you navigated this process. You speak about your certainty that he would recover. How did you grapple with the fact that he didn't? And what did that do to your faith and your faith journey?
Oh, certainly it affected it very, very greatly. Actually, if I speak about faith, it wasn't just when Larry was diagnosed ill and then succumbed. It was when Stuart was diagnosed. And I remember that upon my husband's death, he had just turned 51. He was diagnosed when he was 48. I was in my early 40s or middle 40s at that point. I remember going to synagogue, didn't belong to our synagogue at that time, didn't even think about Minyan, probably didn't even know about it, even though I know that my parents observed it. And I felt, I can't stay here. This isn't for me. How could God take such a good man? He was a man who helped so many. So there was anger. It was definite anger. And I backed off. My daughter has reminded me of this. I backed off faith as if it were here, and I just pulled myself away. No way, thank you. And it probably took me until Larry's illness, which is that 18 years. This is a long time, before I could come back in and really open myself to being in a synagogue, being with faith, being with others with faith, opening myself to what prayers might say, what they might say to me.
What do you think it was that made you ready for that? Was it just time? Was it just that high years? Was it something else that you needed in that moment?
No, it probably was because it was around Larry's illness.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, you know what it was? Sorry, I forgot. When Larry was ill, he had never been one who had really enjoyed going to synagogue. He'd rather play baseball than anything else and what have you. We all know those kinds of stories. He took out the Siddur and began reading it, underscoring prayers, and using it to pray.
So he led you back to faith.
He led me back.
Wow.
I can feel tears in my eyes as I say this.
And were there specific things in the Jewish mourning practice, once you were able to open your heart to them, that were particularly helpful?
Well, surely I grew up in a family that observed Shiva when it was part of ritual. Did I know it or feel it in terms of religious meaning? I can't say that I did. Let me ask the question again. I'm sorry. I think my mind.
If there were particular things. I mean, it was so powerful, this idea that Larry brought you back through his own faith. And I'd love to hear even a little bit more about what you think that faith meant to him. But specifically, as he led you back to faith, were there particular things within the Jewish custom of mourning that you found especially helpful?
I can say not while Larry or Stuart were alive, but after my son's death, and this is when I joined Emmanuel, coming to Minion, I can't tell you how important that was to know, no matter the weather, and we all know some of those horrible storms, and yet we trudge into the synagogue, no matter what, we won't miss it, no matter what. And then to have tea, coffee, breakfast together. Oh, it was so powerful for me. It sort of just pulled me in, really. So Minion was the practice of Minion. Did I know about it? Probably. Did I really know about it? No.
And so you're back to those relationships that are sustaining and supportive. That's beautiful. You had selected a passage to read with us from your book, and I wanted to invite you to read it now, to share it with us so that we can use it as a frame for us continuing this conversation.
I'd love to. Actually, I started looking through what do I want to read, and I probably put like 10 different places that I felt. But let me, I have two. I don't think that you'll just tell me about time, because I know. Yes,
we're good. We're gonna give you a chance to read. I'll dig in a little, and then I'm going to invite everybody here to ask you some questions based on what they've heard.
Thank you. So this is perhaps 2/3 the way into the book, and it's the chapter that is called 5 Years Later. I will just start with this quickly. Stuart was diagnosed with gastric esophageal cancer and given at most 3 months to live. I was sitting very close to his side in his new oncologist's office when we heard the doctor tell us of his diagnosis. He responded with questions. Watching Stuart have a calm conversation with his doctor, I felt amazed. How could he be that way? I was hardly calm. Panic raced through my gut, and in that instant, I felt like a child wanting to bang the floor with my fists and yell, no, stop it. Stop talking. This can't be true. That lasted only moments. It was as if I suddenly remembered where I was and told that child in me to scat. But like any angry child, it didn't quiet down. It gnawed against my skin and bones, begging to break out as I tried to listen and understand what was being said. Little did I know that I was feeling grief as I had never felt before. It was fear, and heavier than any weight I had ever carried, rocking my core as the doctor was speaking words that spelled out my husband's death. My life had turned a screeching angle, and for the rest of that appointment, I traded my spirit for control. I moved into the body of a robot.
So from child to robot, right, is part of those early stages of grief that you are going through. Why did you pick that passage? What is the learning from that piece?
I think how it is that we hear what feels intolerable for us to take in, and how we know on some level, the adult level within us, that we have to open to it. And yet that child within us, that part of us that wants to just cover our eyes and say, no, just take that away, please. Just put it over there, please.
Yeah. And yet you titled the chapter 5 Years Later, right? What is it that comes out as you reflect 5 years later? Is there a maturity in that process, or do you still feel at times like that child, no, I don't like this, I don't want this, take it back?
Well, I was reading that as that was my first experience of hearing a diagnosis that felt like words I never even saw in the dictionary. Words that had so little meaning to me and had to carry my life with it because obviously of what it meant. And I think I chose that. Sure, it's about Stuart, not Larry in the beginning, in this particular piece, but it was about feeling grief, that we feel grief before death. We feel grief when we hear news that is just too hard to take in. And it doesn't have to be that extreme. That there is a part of us that feels such sorrow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I want to invite conversation on this. I've asked a lot of questions tonight. Is there anyone else who would like to ask Ruth a question? Stephen Lesser, you can actually share your question if you want, or I'll speak it for you. I wonder how your grandchildren are doing so many years later. How can we help young children to cope when tragedy strikes? Thank you, Stephen, for that beautiful question.
Oh, I think that's such a wonderful question. You know, when I'm telling you that I didn't know how to stand on my own 2 feet, how do I help my children or my grandchildren? How do we then reach in and pull out the strength that is there someplace, although we doubt that it's any place? I think we have to listen, allow chance to talk. We don't have to have answers. We just need to say, let's talk about it. Open up relationship to listen. I don't know if that answers your question, Steve.
Great. Oh, we have another question from Michael Gardner who would like to speak it himself. Michael, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey, Ruth, it's so nice to see you. And thank you so much for being a part of this. One of the parts of your story, which I found certainly true, but also most upsetting, is that in many respects, it seems to me there are 2 losses or 2 deaths, as it were. There's the final passing of the person, to be sure, but you point out, I think, an early part of your book, that as the person who is ill almost has to retreat into themselves, so they cease to be the person that you knew for most of your life.
Oh, that's so important.
And they and so you lose an important connection with them before they're ever actually gone. And that strikes me as, one, so sad, because you're having a loss before you've actually had the loss. And I don't know how you begin to deal with that.
My response is not an answer to your question. I'm so glad for your question. I'd like, Michelle, perhaps we can put it out to others. You know, I feel that I was different in each of these losses in terms of retreating, finding myself feeling different, being different. Are parts of my personality, are parts of me coming forward where other parts sort of withdrew and rested. I wouldn't say rested, but moved away. I don't know if I'm even responding, but I'd love it if we could open that.
You know, Ruth, I think one of the things that you have helped me to see is to identify grief as not only what happens after somebody dies, as we're talking about, but as Michael so beautifully said, in all those stages, as we're preparing for that loss and steeling ourselves for that loss and not being ready for that loss. I guess Michael, could I reframe and ask you, you're so good at questions, right? Could I ask you to sort of focus in really concretely on, are you asking, you know, how do I cope with that phase? Or is there some different way that I could engage that phase that could help me as I move towards that eventual grief that
Well,
we can't
you're
avoid?
you're way ahead of me, not surprisingly. I'm just stuck on the sort of the double tragedy of it, that the person ultimately dies, so you've had that loss. But in the run up to the permanent loss, you can't even, in many cases, the person, just because we all know when we're sick, I mean, just when you have the flu, you don't want anyone around you. You want to retreat to your bed.
Exactly.
And you want them to just go away. And I'm sure that's magnified, 1,000-fold when you're facing a really serious illness. So it becomes so hard for the person who's going to continue to live to relate to the person who's now in this new stage where they very likely don't want to engage with you in the way that they have for the number of years you've been blessed to be to each other. And that's got to be, I'm just focusing on the tragedy of that initial loss, because it's so hard. I mean, and just at the moment when it seems to me, you want to be as close as you possibly can be.
Mhm.
I suspect that becomes much more difficult to achieve that.
Yeah, I thank you for holding the profound nature of just the loss after the loss after the loss that comes. And in some ways we're holding that. Ruth, thank you so much for unfolding that for us. And I guess I would ask as a follow-up, is there anything that you've learned from the final loss that can help us with those intermediate losses?
Oh, that's such a good question. This is such important material to think about. Are there any answers to these questions? I think the time, as you're referring to, Michael, sometimes we sort of close up when we need to be more open. How is it that we can open when we're feeling ourselves close up? We can't. In a way, we have to accept and understand what we're going through, and we don't.
Yeah, and we don't want it.
Yeah, I think this is when, if I come back to the bereavement group, I mean, that's after the loss, but there could be even an anticipatory bereavement group. People who are caring for people who are quite ill, or who they're afraid may become quite ill. I mean, I wouldn't know how to define it. I have to think a bit, not just a bit, quite a bit.
I appreciate that about you, that you want to marinate on that. So while you're doing that, let's invite Ruth Gold, who has a question.
Sure.
You need to unmute, Ruth.
Thank you for calling on me, but I'm gonna pass for right now.
You'll pass. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Then I will, I'll turn to Louise Wolf's question, which was, if someone's way of coping is to turn into a robot, are there many ways, or even any ways, to help them back to feeling fully human as they deal with their grief?
Certainly, my way, since I am a therapist, would be to turn, whether it is to turn to a therapist, turn to a friend, turn to a family member, turn to a rabbi, to whomever is important and who you trust to talk. I don't know that one can just change back. I think one is changed. But I think that one needn't stay a robot. I didn't. I just felt like one at certain points. And I think that we're learning about ourselves and just the impact that such tragedy has on us, that we have to be mindful of ourselves, be compassionate with ourselves as well. I don't know who can be compassionate under those kinds of circumstances, but I would wish for it.
Amen. Amen. I'm now, Judy Pogani asked a question about if you could please speak to the relationship that unfolded between you as a mother and your son in his young adulthood.
Before he was ill, or?
Judy, can you clarify? Do you want to know about before he was ill or while he was ill and they were having this change and shift in the relationship as she helped to care for him?
I mean, while he was ill.
While he was ill. Thank
Yeah.
you for asking that. Larry and I had a close relationship. When Larry was born, it wasn't 3 months before he was ill and in the hospital. He had respiratory issues, actually a malformed half of his lung, as it turned out. And when he was older, went through surgery to repair that, but we didn't know that at the time. So that I'm sort of losing the train. Wait a minute, ask the question again. I'm sorry, it's a very important question.
Absolutely. So the way that Judy articulated it was, can you speak about the relationship that unfolded between you as a mother and your son when he was really a young adult himself? And here you are grappling with an illness that shifts your dynamic back to you as a much more of a caretaker role again, as you had been when he was younger.
You know, I would say that because of those early years and the kind of care that he needed, and he did grow out of that and had a very usual kind of preteen and into teenage years, we always maintained a closeness. Now, I can't say that that is what is in all relationships or in family relationships, but that relationship happened to be a close relationship. It isn't like he would only confide in me, but there was just a respect or a kind of, I would say, a basic love that was there, that I was always grateful for. And I will say also contributed to the mourning that I experienced upon his death. And how difficult it was.
Was there anything in his being a young adult? Was there, you spoke about how he gave you the gift of being able to find your tradition and your faith again. Were there other things that he was able to set down for you in his own grappling with his illness and his own processing that were helpful to you later as you grieved?
Those are very good questions. I think his being who this is a very simple answer to a question that requires much more thought, but just being who he was one who listened. I mean, though he loved to do what everybody else loved to do at that age, there was always this closeness, and I think born of his early years and the closeness that I think both of us would have wished didn't need to be there. I don't know if that answers your question either, but I think it was a particular relationship. And I remember, I don't know what this has to do with your question, but I remember when I was driving the car, and the kids would always sit in the back seat, and my son stood up and leaned on the front seat. And it was at a time when I was particularly sad about something, and there probably were tears, and he probably saw that through the mirror. And he stood up and leaned on that front seat, and he said, "I know what's bothering you, Mom. You were cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha." And he went on and told me, and darn it, if he wasn't exactly right. So there was that capacity. So I think it was what he brought himself that allowed for that kind of closeness, though it didn't keep him from being the preteen, the teen, the young adult that he was and needed to be.
And how did you navigate the relationship as he became more and more ill?
Well, the first thing is that I wasn't I navigated it by moving back to Boston. And I rented a place close to my daughter, who I haven't talked much about tonight because I've been emphasizing my son, but my daughter who lived in Amesbury at that time. So I forgot exactly the town that we found, a small house or a large apartment, I'm not even recalling at this point, where I literally moved in with my son so that I could be there and take care of what needed to be. I mean, there's no way. I went through my husband's illness. There's no way I was going to let my son be alone during this time.
Well, speaking of family and family closeness, your niece, Robin, is on this Zoom as well. And I want to invite her to come up here on the screen, Robin Steinberg, and have your question or comment together with your aunt.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Hi, Aunt Ruth.
Hi, you knew Larry so you grew up with him.
I grew up with Larry. He was a year older than me. We grew up, I'm a little emotional about it. And when I read the book, I read it in like one sitting. And I just like totally relived the loss. It was beautiful because it was my aunt's story. And there were details that I just, of course, never knew because there's a lot of medical day to day. But let me just say for this group, my cousin was 6'4" and movie star gorgeous.
Oh, I didn't bring that in.
And I know, but I will. And I couldn't understand how somebody that was so physically strong, shoulders out, I mean, seriously, like, could get sick. And when my uncle died, I was in college, and it was profoundly sad, but abstract and kind of other at the time, because he was an adult in a way that all adults over 40 were older. And it was harder and to this day, I feel the loss in very profound ways, but it was different than your cousin who's your age. And every birthday, because our birthdays are only a month apart, a year, but a month, I think of Larry would be 50, Larry would be 53, Larry would be 55. And I hit those milestones and I think Larry didn't get out of 39 is the way I think of it. So I don't know. Let me tell you about my aunt otherwise though. My mother has Alzheimer's. And when we talk about losing somebody before you lose them.
Oh God, indeed.
I would not be able to get through the years I have caretaken for my mother if my aunt, now I'm long married, I have adult children, I have a world full of girlfriends, but it's my aunt who is my rock.
Wow.
And it's such a gift. I know she's been a gift to the synagogue and she's a gift to the bereavement group and she's a gift to everybody who knows her. But I literally would not have gotten through. She is the person you go to when you have such complicated feelings, grief being this talk tonight, but it's so much more. And last February, it was like piling on the grief, but like, I guess just to show that all of us, I'm sure, could go into the little squares here and tell us about their story and they'd have some version of this. But my best friend died. And Ruth came in and we were a group of strangers that were dealing with this friend who was in her last circle of life. And Ruth came in and facilitated our meetings in social work for us as an emergency to get us through the crisis and through to the other side of it. And was able to just drop into this situation and get it and get us and understand it and carry us through in a way that I don't know how we would have done it without her, to be perfectly honest. So
Robin, if you could say in one sentence, what was Ruth's most helpful piece of advice for you?
Okay, because honestly, some of the answer to that is in how she does it too. There is a way that she hears you and listens to you which absolutely envelops you in a comfortable support in such a way that you didn't even know you were in so much pain until you were soothed. And so I would say that, but I think it starts with an acceptance of the ugliness of the experience, and not a fighting of it or a conflict with it. It's an acceptance of it. And then we swirl it into the comforting with the support and the understanding and the love that can infuse in that and help dilute the sting of the painful part. And she's just able to do that. You know what I mean? Like she's just able to do that like nobody I've ever known.
Well, it's such a blessing that you shared and that you spoke, and thank you so much for sharing. We all love Ruth so much, and you're blessed to have her in your family.
Can I hug you, please?
So speaking of family, and I wanted to ask you this really wonderful question that Ann Johnson posed, which is a question about hope, right? Robin spoke a little bit to how if you don't fight, if you're able to kind of accept, and if you're embraced in that beautiful relationship, knowing that you are loved, then it brings some sense of healing and hope. And Anne asks, where and how do you find joy again as you process loss and rebuilding? Are there ways that one can bring joy into the rebuilding?
You mean someone else bring joy into?
I think she means, can you yourself? Is there a place, a way that we can bring in joy into this process of mourning, whether again or simply as a piece of how we mourn? And she doesn't refer to, is she referring to remembering the wonderful things that we shared with our loved ones? Or is she thinking about ways that we personally kind of open ourselves up again to speak? I think either side would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on.
Michelle,
Anne, please.
yeah, this is Ruth. Thank you for being here and doing this tonight. Yes, it's a combination. The question that I'm asking is really related to we ourselves in our process of rebuilding. When we're in grief, it's very difficult for us to see beyond that which is non-joy, that which is non-hope, that which is you can go on with your list. Do you feel ways that you can bring that hope into this process of rebuilding for yourself, not looking for it externally? I think we always have to resolve what we're going through in terms of grief. We have to resolve it internally. So that joy really has to come internally as well, I would think. I don't know. I'm curious what you will say about this.
I think that's quite profound and quite important. When the first part of the question, I don't know that I can respond to the last, but the first part of what about joy with mourning? Is there such a thing? Can they hold hands in a way? And I would say yes. I think, I in my own practice, I use internal family systems, which refers to parts of us. So we have parts of us that are deep in mourning. There are other parts of us that want to be in life and want to feel life. So that, I would think it's quite unique and individual, as I think grief is anyway. And I think the whole circumstances around whatever grief is being mourned, but the joy does come from inside. I mean, it can be as simple as joyful from having known this person, or been with this person, or been with this person at this particular time. But I think the question is deeper than that. And with great respect, I don't feel I can answer. I'd have to think about it, but I'd like to think about it because it's such an important thing, such an important aspect. Do others have? I'd like to open it to hear what others might be thinking about.
That is your expertise in group facilitation there.
I'm not, you know, it's really important. I think we're capable of many feelings at the same time. Are they the same weight? Are they the same size? Are they the same whatever? Questions that I don't know, but I'd love to hear how others think about it or how it strikes others.
Leslie put something beautiful into the chat. She said we can be intentional about finding joy during mourning. And Leslie, would you like to add more to it? You can certainly unmute yourself and share if you'd like at Ruth's
Sure.
invitation.
And I can remember after my husband died and that I was in such deep grief, and I joined Temple Emmanuel not long after that. And at some point, so I found tremendous joy in that marriage, and I was intentional about finding pockets of joy during mourning. And I can remember being at a Shabbat Alive service with friends on either side of me, holding hands, and the music was so beautiful, and I felt joy in that moment. So we can find pockets of it, and I think it's important to be intentional to look for it.
Oh, beautiful.
Thank you. So beautiful, Leslie. Would anybody else like to share? Okay. So then Peggy, please. Peggy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that I think my husband had pancreatic cancer and died after 18 months. And that was almost 5 years ago. And I remember thinking that he wanted me to experience joy. And so that helped me. Because one of his greatest fears that he talked about before he died was his fear for me after he had died. And he was a primary support to me while he was ill, encouraging me to take good care of myself, encouraging me to stay connected to friends and all of that kind of thing. So I knew that he wanted me to experience joy. And I reminded myself of that.
Oh, really?
That helped.
So powerful, so powerful. So I'm going to give one more moment if anybody else wants to chime in. Judy.
I have been in Ruth's group, and I had gone to many places to find peace because my father died instantaneously. He fell and the clot went from the heart, the leg to the heart. And I was in another state. And I didn't realize, I went to Ruth's groups several times, and it's not your feeling. It's what everybody else feels and says that gives you peace. And Ruth is a good source of that because she's strong. Even she gives you the strength.
Judy, thank you so much. And so Ruth, we want to thank you for sharing.
I can't hear you. You're muted.
So I want to thank you for sharing your story with us, for sharing your guidance with us, for sharing your grace with us. Ruth, losing Larry is not only a book, it is also the story of your life. And you have opened that story to us and to everyone who has the blessing to encounter you in a way that has enabled that story to create blessing, to create hope, to create possibility, and to open new windows of life. And so we just want to bless you, Ruth, that this journey to become an author, that this journey to share your wisdom more broadly will be one from which you continue to learn and grow and receive as much love as all of us feel for you tonight. Chizki ve'imtzi, be strong and of good courage. Thank you so very, very much, Ruth, from all of us to you.
And thank you for the opportunity and for me to hear others' reflections. I would love this to continue so that we can continue talking. And I don't mean in this forum, in any forum.
So
Thank
Ruth,
you.
I'm going to ask to conclude. As we conclude, I'd like to ask you to offer us a blessing.
Goodness. Let us be within ourselves, be open with ourselves, to open to life, to open to others, and to continue listening and sharing. I thank you so very much.
Amen, amen, amen. Laila tov lekulam. Good night, everyone. And thank you again, Ruth.
Thank you, Michelle.
That was beautiful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Yeah, very beautiful.
Ruth, you were terrific.
Oh my God. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that, Judy. I mean, honestly, it's one thing to be quiet in your writing and be at a desk or be in your, wherever you are in bed writing, who knows what. It's another to be public, and not just public, but, you
And
know,
surrounded by friends.
and surrounded by friends. Thank you. Thank you. How rich that is. That's the
See you
joy.
in synagogue.
Yes.
Amen, amen.
Thank you so very much. Oh,
Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you all for being here, and thank each of you who have organized this. I know, Arza, you were instrumental in getting the Death Cafe to us. I don't know who else to thank who's on this call, who created this format and this venue. Just deep gratitude to each of you for giving us the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations.
thank you, Michelle.
Very powerful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. We all learned so much more today, Ruth. Thank you so much.
Judy.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Judy,
And Godspeed.
God bless.
As we lead the bereavement group.
Right.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Laila Tov will give you just 2 more minutes to say your goodbyes to Ruth and hopefully lehitraot.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. This is a lovely opportunity. I appreciate it so.
Thank you all. Okay. So it's 9:05. So we're going to say Laila Tov to everyone, and we're going to end the call with deep gratitude to you, Ruth, for your grace.
Thank you. And for you, Michelle, just opening it and making it comfortable.